Chapter 11, New People. Hilda had no recollection of her father going to church. She recalled their neighbors doing so, but not her father. Carl Thorson would spend a good part of his Sunday morning in the barn, mending the wagons, or else helping her ailing mother with things about the house. Then he would sit down and read the paper. He often read the paper aloud to her mother, but Hilda understood nothing of the reading and very little of the subsequent conversation. For the papers were in a foreign language, and the things her parents talked about were of the old world, which she did not know. After her mother's death, when her father married again, Hilda's stepmother and her children went to church regularly. They were Catholic, but her father continued to stay at home. Neither her father nor her mother, while she was yet alive, talked religion to her, but in the summer they would send her to Sunday school with the Everett children. Sunday school was held in a small wooden church on the outskirts of Stillwell. Never within Hilda's memory was a sermon preached in that church. It did not seem to be equipped much for preaching, but it was well equipped for the giving of church socials. There was a basement with facilities for freezing ice cream, making lemonade, and preparing sandwiches, and the church was used in that direction liberally. Every 2 weeks or so, a social was held in it. Sometimes these socials were accompanied by a speech from a leading citizen, but speech or no speech, they always ended in a jolly time for all. The religion which she had imbibed from her 3 summers at the Sunday school, in the winter it was too far for her to go, was a mixture of biblical stories and parables with wholesome exhortations about being honest and upright and being kind to one's neighbors. Hilda liked the stories of the Old Testament about the Egyptians, the Romans, the Jews, and would, in her childish way, often reconstruct the lost worlds of which her Bible lessons spoke. Great was her surprise when one day she learned that one of these biblical peoples, the Jews, had survived to the present day. Yes, and there were even some 4 or 5 Jewish families living in Stillwell. She was curious and often wished to see a Jew. One day her curiosity was gratified. There came to their yard a Jewish peddler. Her mother, who avoided exertions and did not go to town very often, made the Jew take down the pack from his shoulders, and she chose a number of articles from it: elastic, lace, buttons. While her mother was testing the material, Hilda was examining the man. He was fairly tall, and his face was covered with a black, spade-like beard. The Jew caught the strangely fixed gaze of the child upon him and smiled. Hilda was astonished to see him smile. She somehow thought that a man with a beard like that, and whose lineage descended from the days of the Old Testament, could not possibly be smiling. It was noon. Her father had just come into the yard. Carl Thorson exchanged a few words with the peddler and asked him to dinner. At the table, the man did not eat their meat, and her father, who seemed to know all about the stranger's habits, suggested that eggs be boiled for him. Throughout the meal, her father spoke with the peddler, and her mother followed the conversation with interest. It was of the old world they talked, and it was partly because of this, and partly because of the peddler's manner of speaking the English language, that the conversation remained indistinguishable to Hilda. To help him out in conversation, the man would frequently resort to words which she heard her father say were German and which Carl Thorson understood. Several times during the meal, Hilda caught the peddler's eyes resting on her, and then his fixed look would dissolve itself into contemplation. As he was leaving, the Jew gave her a red and blue rubber ball. She gazed after him until he disappeared behind the neighboring hill, and then she went into the house and began to ply her mother with questions. The man, her mother told her, was a stranger in the land. He had come from a faraway country, from across the sea, and had left his wife and children there. Among his children was a girl of Hilda's own age and size, and when he had earned sufficiently to pay for the passage of his wife and children, he would send for them to come to America. But that would not be soon. It would take at least 3 or 4 years until he would have earned sufficient money to pay for their journey. Hilda thought about the peddler for days after. She was brooding about his family, especially about the girl who was her own age. She hoped fervently that the man would have luck and would earn quickly the necessary money to send for his wife and children. This Jew of her childhood memories, the aged peddler with his spade-like beard, who had once smiled so sadly on her, rose before Hilda's eyes one afternoon when the day's work at the machine was beginning to fall heavy on her and would not leave her for a long time. The image came again the next day and the day after, and it always came in the late afternoon when her limbs were weary from struggling with the machine, the cloth, the cotton. At first, she could not make out the significance of the picture of the image that was constantly returning to her. One afternoon, however, when her eyes were filmed with the heat, dust, and perspiration, the significance of the recurring picture dawned upon her. She had undergone a transformation. It was she who was the Jew she had seen as a child. She was a stranger and alone. She was separated from her family. She was carrying a pack on her back, only her pack was a machine and did not fit smoothly. She was trying to conquer this machine, to squeeze a living out of it for herself, for her child, who was far removed from her, who was in the day nursery from 7 in the morning until 6:15 in the evening. She was the Jew. She was being pitied. She was being pitied. That was no illusion. There was no mistake about that. Her presence in the factory had become known to score upon score of girls and to the few men that were working there, and everyone pitied her. Eyes were constantly turned toward her with sad, sympathetic questioning. The sweatshop was a natural enough place for a young Jewess who had escaped the Russian Pale and pogroms. It was fit enough for the Italian or Bohemian young woman who had been but a short time in this country. But for a Yankee, for a girl born and bred in America to come to a sweatshop, that was unheard of. Only a great tragedy could have induced such an American girl to come down to this work, and the girls and men about her were searching for that tragedy in Hilda's appearance, looks, and actions. The only oasis in the desert of strange faces was Mrs. Breen, the young woman with whom Hilda had become acquainted on her first day in the shop. They were going out to lunch together regularly, and often during the afternoon, when Hilda's strength seemed to be ebbing and her spirits drooped, a smile from her newly acquired friend across the 2 rows of machines would tear apart the curtain of gloom from in front of her eyes. Mrs. Breen was 32 years old, slightly below medium height, and plump. Her olive-complexioned features were framed by a wealth of wavy black hair. Her eyes were big, dark, and strangely mobile, like prisoners dreaming of freedom but locked in a cell. She had been a widow 2.5 years and was supporting a son of 10. Her speech was meticulous, and her British enunciation of certain words especially caught Hilda's ear. At the end of the third week, Hilda found in her pay envelope $8. The previous week, she had had only 5. She imparted this to her friend. "Not bad," Mrs. Breen commented. "I guess the forelady is pretty decent with you. She ought to be." What Mrs. Breen implied was that Hilda, being the only Christian American girl in the shop, the forelady, who was also a Christian American, ought to give her a chance. But Hilda, in whom questions of religion and race were not as keenly developed as in the Jewess, did not get the drift of her friend's remark. She was absorbed in thoughts about the factory, her work, her prospects. "You'll soon be making $10, $12, and even $15 a week," Mrs. Breen was telling her, "and you had better save as much as you can. In this trade, you may expect a strike almost any time." At the mention of the word strike, a cloud flitted over Hilda's face. A few days later, they were again talking about strikes and the possibility of being out of work. Mrs. Breen became confidential with Hilda. "This isn't a union shop," she said, "and it's not advisable to say much about the union around here. All the same, you ought to try and join it a little later. It's a help and protection at times." "Do you belong to the union?" Hilda asked. "Yes," Mrs. Breen replied, "but don't tell anyone around here." Several times that afternoon, Hilda and Mrs. Breen exchanged smiles and glances as if they had a great secret between them. That evening, they went home together. The following day, Hilda's machine in the shop stood idle. She had not shown up for work, nor did she come the day after. In the evening, someone rapped at her door. It was Mrs. Breen. "I guessed as much," her friend said when she looked at the babe sitting in Hilda's lap listlessly. "He's been ill?" She took little Raymond, and he submitted to her without a murmur. "He'll be all right again in the morning." Mrs. Breen cheered both mother and child. Hilda was delighted. She asked her friend to stay to supper with her, but the latter declined. "Some other time," she said. "I must rush home now. This is the night when my boy takes his music lesson." "Does your son take music lessons?" Hilda asked, a thrill running through her. She was thinking of her own boy. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Breen answered with a dash of pride in her voice. "He plays the violin splendidly. The teachers tell me that. I must get you over to my place one evening soon and have him play for you." Hilda came to work the next day. During the morning, Mrs. Breen several times signaled to her with her eyes, intimating that she had something to tell her. Judging by the smile on her face, it was something pleasant. As soon as the machine stopped, they met. "My boy," Mrs. Breen said, "has hit up a grand idea. Let's make a picnic next Sunday." Hilda concurred heartily. It was decided that Mrs. Breen and her boy would come to Hilda's house in the morning, and from there they would go together to Prospect Park in Brooklyn. A hot July sun was beating down upon the city, and when Mrs. Breen and Hilda had reached the park a little before noon that Sunday, all the choice picnic places were gone. After a brief search, however, they found a shady spot not far from the water, and they took possession of it. Mrs. Breen was managing the party. In the art of picnicking, she was an expert. When her husband was alive, she was telling Hilda, they seldom spent a summer Sunday at home, going either to the seashore or into the country. Her husband had loved the woods. Hilda had no more than let her child down on the grass when Willie, Mrs. Breen's 10-year-old son, took complete charge of him. At first, she was nervous, afraid lest the older boy prove careless or boisterous and in some manner injure her child. But she was soon reassured. With the hunger for companionship common to an only child, Willie was at once absorbed in the little fellow. He was playing with him and guiding him like an older brother. As she watched her child trying to respond to the older boy's tricks and conversation, it seemed to Hilda as if her son had become bigger, older. Little Raymond seemed to be growing before her very eyes. Mrs. Breen was skimming through the Sunday newspaper, and Hilda took a part of it and scanned it also. The paper now seemed to her like an unthreaded machine which runs through the cloth but leaves no seam. She was looking at the printed page, but her mind refused to retain anything of what she saw. It seemed to her that never yet had she seen grass so beautifully green. A mellow fragrance was stirring her blood. It was as if the earth was bursting with tenderness and emotion. She stretched herself upon the ground and lay silent for some minutes, and in these minutes she compressed the vital memories of her 24 years. She was oblivious of Mrs. Breen, who, reclining on one arm, was studying the relaxed form of her friend. Hilda was thinking of Raymond Everett. He had graduated from college by this time. No doubt he had a girl. Who was she? Was he happy with her? And had he put her, Hilda, completely out of his mind? Was it possible that he never felt that he was a father? That a child of his was growing up somewhere, alone in the world? She tried to analyze her feelings towards him. There had been times before the child came when she had hated Raymond, when she could have torn him limb from limb for the shame, the pain, the suffering he had caused her. But that time was past. She was blaming herself now. She should have known better. And running away from her, he had acted true to form. He was always a nice but weak boy. Even though he was a year older than herself, she should have been the stronger of the two. She should have known better. Suppose he came. It suddenly occurred to her. Suppose they met unexpectedly. What would she do? Could she still love him, trust him, go with him? Her face contracted in pain. "A penny for your thoughts," Mrs. Breen broke into her reveries. "They aren't worth more," Hilda said, sitting up and searching with her eyes for the child. Nevertheless, she went back to her thoughts, and Mrs. Breen, in spite of her pretended lightness, was also in a somber, reminiscent mood. When an hour later they had finished their dinner and the children were playing by themselves a little distance away, Mrs. Breen began telling Hilda about her husband and how they had met 12 years earlier in London. She produced a small volume, a bound collection of pamphlets on socialism. It opened with a brochure by Prince Peter Kropotkin entitled An Appeal to the Young. The third or fourth pamphlet in the collection was headed Workers Arise, and the author of it was given as Leon Breen. That's my husband, Mrs. Breen said, pointing to the name on the title page. Your husband was a writer? Hilda gazed at her in surprise. My husband, Mrs. Breen corrected her, was a socialist editor and speaker. This pamphlet here was a speech of his. He delivered it on the 1st of May, 12 years ago in Hyde Park. I can see him still on the platform. She was describing to Hilda their life in London, and she talked of that life as one talks of a lost paradise. She named great Englishmen, and more especially great Russians. Her husband was a Russian, with whom they had mingled in the past in England. Mr. Breen had been a disciple of Kropotkin, and teacher and pupil had often spoken from the same platform. An urgent call from a revolutionary labor group in America brought her husband and herself to New York. To begin with, life in the New World was interesting. It was filled with so many small personal comforts they had not had in England. Her husband's earnings were much larger. They took a steam-heated flat. They had electricity and every convenience. But they did not have it for long. Death came. Mr. Breen returned from a meeting one night drenched to the bone. He was in bed several weeks. The doctor cautioned them against pneumonia. But there was no pneumonia. The cold had settled on the kidneys. The struggle with disease lasted for 6 months. Then her husband died. The children, tired from play, had slipped up to them for a rest. Hilda took little Raymond in her lap. Willie sat beside his mother listening. Hilda was studying Willie's head and face. He had fine, sensitive features. By looking at the son, she was trying to construct a picture of the father. When Mrs. Breen reached the part about her husband's last illness and death, a sad brooding came into her son's face. She grew silent. They were all silent, and this silence only emphasized the life and laughter about them. The park swarmed with people, girls in 2s and 3s, boys in groups of 6 and 8, families, couples, children, lonely young and old men. There's Mr. Raboff, Willie jumped up in a twinkling. Where? His mother asked, and instinctively her hand went up to her hair. But Willie was off. Alex, Alex, he shouted, running up to a youngster his own age, and the two put their arms about each other like old friends. Mrs. Breen rose. London friends, she whispered to Hilda, and went to meet the approaching couple and their 2 children. She shook hands with the man. With the woman she kissed. Meet my friend, Mrs. Thorson, she introduced Hilda. Mr. Raboff, this with feigned threat to Hilda, is the secretary-treasurer of the Waste Makers Union. If you don't watch out, he's going to rope you into his organization. That's right, the man smiled. We are in the midst of a soul-saving campaign just now. But, he took up Mrs. Breen's mood, how comes it that you haven't brought your friend around to the union till now? Haven't you been delinquent? I have not, she said with mock protest. I have already spoken to Mrs. Thorson about the union, haven't I, Hilda? It was the first time Mrs. Breen had called Hilda by her first name. It seemed natural after the intimate conversation that passed between them. Go on, put Mrs. Thorson through the 3rd degree, Mrs. Raboff now addressed her husband, while Ada and I run off and have a little talk by ourselves. You proud thing, never showing yourself, was all Hilda caught of the conversation between Ada Breen and her friend. Willie had now run off to play with the Reboff children, and little Raymond stood beside her. She sat down again, and he put his little head in her lap. Reboff sat down on the grass near her. "Mrs. Breen and my wife are old friends," he explained. "They went to school together in England. We came to America, too, about the same time. Did you know Mr. Breen?" Hilda stated that her acquaintance with Mrs. Breen began only a short time back in the factory. "Then you are not English?" he asked. "No, I am American. From the Middle West," Hilda smiled. She had become accustomed to being studied by foreigners as if she were a stranger. "I thought that there was something about you that did not belong here, that was not New Yorkish," Reboff continued. Then he asked her about the West. To Hilda, his questions were reminiscent. Ernest White had often talked about the West in the same manner. Apparently, it was an immigrant trait to dream of the West while staying in the crowded cities of the East. Spurred on by Reboff's interest, she described to him the average home in the small town in Wisconsin as she had known it, the frame house, the yard, the barn. Her father, she said, never locked the stable door. They never feared thieves. Reboff listened and seemed to be making comparisons. "You would think," he said, "from the way people are crowding in New York, that space in America is at a premium. And yet, in reality, there is so much land, so much." He was speaking about the working class in America and came to the Waste Workers Union once more. His organization, he was saying, was fighting for immediate improvement of conditions in the trade. But that was only a part of its program. His union had other aims. All the other leaders were like himself, socialists, and the chief principle underlying their agitation was the education of the workmen in the union to the iniquity of the present system. He stopped to dilate upon this iniquity. Industry was at the present time owned by a handful of capitalists. It should be owned by the people. "Of course," he added, "our union is very much ahead of the average labor organizations in America. It is composed mostly of foreign workers, and in this respect, I believe, we are more advanced than the American workers. We are more alive to big problems." Hilda listened and was thinking how strange life was. Here a man, an important man, was sitting, talking to her, taking her in his confidence. Mr. Reboff was evidently considering her a nice person. Was she really a nice person? And that with Raymond, the child? Was it nothing? Would she ever have the feeling, the conviction that nothing, really nothing, had ever been the matter with her? Reboff was talking about another phase of the Union. It was not only a wartime weapon, it was also a sort of family institution. "It inspires a feeling of solidarity among the workers," he was saying. "You feel that you are not alone. In sickness, your union brothers and sisters come to your aid." The last words sank into Hilda's mind. Alone. She had been so much alone all her life. She asked about the meetings. Were they held often? Was attendance compulsory? If so, she could not join. She could not come to meetings much. She was alone with the child. "Alone with the child," the labor leader repeated, and for the moment seemed oblivious of Hilda. Thought and sorrow blended in his eyes. As he sat thus subdued and with traces of suffering in his face, Hilda examined him. He appeared 37 or 38 years old, of slender build, and wore his dark hair rather long. He did not look like a laboring man. He appeared more like a teacher. He might even pass for a minister. They had such a minister once in Stillwell. "You had better join our organization," he said after some debate with himself. "I think you need an organization. That about meetings and the baby will be all right." He took out a card and began writing down her address. "What did I tell you?" Mrs. Breen's voice rang out triumphantly. "Our missionary's been on the job, and another soul goes into the golden book." Mrs. Raboff sat down on the grass beside Hilda. Her husband was questioning Willie about his school and his music. Mrs. Breen listened thoughtfully. Finally, Raboff rose. It was time for them to go. They still had a visit to make that afternoon. He shook hands warmly with Hilda. "You will hear from me in a few days," he said in parting. His wife was exacting a promise from Mrs. Breen that she would be over to see them the following week. When they were gone, and Hilda and Mrs. Breen were alone once more, a restlessness came over them. The spot upon which they had been sitting seemed to have lost its charm and repose. At Hilda's suggestion, they started on a stroll through the park.